Okay, so we've learned our key argument concepts as well as about conditionals and the valid inference form of modus ponens. In order to use arguments to do philosophy, our two most important skills are going to be to identify what argument someone is giving and to evaluate how good of an argument it is. Since these two skills are not independent, we will start with the more fundamental one, evaluating arguments. Whenever we evaluate arguments, we are always going to take a critical, attacking perspective. It's obvious why you will want to take this perspective toward arguments whose conclusions you disagree with, such as Peter Singer's, for example. But we will also always take this perspective toward arguments whose conclusions we agree with or hope are true. There is some psychological evidence that when people learn how to criticize arguments, they actually become less responsive to new evidence, more irrational rather than less. This seems to be because people apply the skill of attacking arguments selectively, only to arguments whose conclusions they disagree with. So in order to avoid that pitfall, we will always be relentlessly critical of all arguments, and especially of our own. This is why people say that philosophy develops the skill of critical thinking. Since the gold standard for arguments is soundness, we are always going to criticize arguments by trying to show that they do not meet that gold standard. In other words, we will always attack them by trying to show that they are not formally valid, or else by trying to show that not all of their premises are true. Let's focus on formal validity first. Since formal validity is validity plus a further condition, one way that an argument can be formally invalid and thus not sound is if it's valid, but not formally valid. But this is not a great way to object to an argument. Whenever an argument is merely valid, but not formally valid, there's always another premise that could be added to the argument that would make it formally valid. And moreover, that premise is always true. So such an argument can be easily fixed, and we have a guarantee that if the argument is unsound, it must be because some other premise is false. Since we should never criticize an argument by saying that it is merely valid and not formally valid, the important issue in criticizing an argument will always be to show that it's not valid at all. But the same problem arises all over again. We can always fix any invalid argument in order to make it formally valid by adding a conditional premise. Of course, if an argument is not valid at all, there's no guarantee that this added premise will be true. But criticizing an argument as invalid obscures the difference between cases in which it's true and cases in which it's not. For example, since we did listen to a podcast in Phil 166 that uses a monkey example, the conditional premise that we need to make this argument formally valid is true, and the only way resisting the conclusion is if George is not a monkey. In contrast, there's no true premise that can be added to this argument to make it formally valid. Since the only invalid arguments that are worth objecting to are ones that cannot be made valid by adding true premises, instead of criticizing arguments for being formally invalid, we will always focus on making them formally valid first, and then reserve our critical efforts for their premises. So let's turn to what it takes to criticize a premise of an argument. Since an argument needs every premise to be true in order to be sound, all it takes to criticize an argument is to identify one false premise. But since we are being critical thinkers and trying to make philosophy a straightforward methodical process, we will always try to criticize every premise of an argument. Once we know the best criticisms of each premise, we can rank our objections and choose the best one. In this class, we will distinguish between three skill levels at identifying criticisms of the premises of an argument. The fundamental level 1 skill is to identify what it would take for the premise to be false. For example, for this first premise to be false, George would have to be something other than a monkey. For example, he could be a bear, an elephant, or even a wrench. Likewise, for a generalized condition like this one to be false, there must be an example that makes the antecedent true and the consequent false. In this case, a monkey is not a lawyer, perhaps this one. Level 2 skill for criticizing premises is to assess the plausibility of whether, once we know what it takes for a premise to be false, a given premise really is false. For example, it's very implausible that George is not a monkey, but it's very plausible that not all monkeys are lawyers. Applying this level 2 skill is the first step at identifying which objections to the premises are the most forceful. Finally, the level 3 skill for criticizing the premises of arguments will be to understand which objections to premises can be fixed and which cannot. Repairing arguments from objections will be the subject of another video. So, until then.